Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to an informational meeting hosted by the Montana Public Service Commission. This date, June 24th, 2024, it is 2 p.m. We are at the Bollinger Hearing Room of the Montana Public Service Commission in Helena, Montana. The purpose of today's meeting is to gather information regarding the topic of protecting Montana's energy infrastructure from wildfire. This is a discussion today between the Montana Public Service Commission and invited agency representatives. The participants include public service commissioners, myself, Jennifer Fielder. I am the vice president of the commission and chair of today's meeting. And with me, we have Commissioner Annie Bukacek. And online, we have Commissioner Tony O'Donnell. And our guest presenters today, we have Zev Hunting from the U.S. Forest Service. With him is Mr. Joe Coleman with the United States Forest Service. And then we have Kyla Mackey from the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Thank you for being here today. This is an open public meeting. Live viewing is available in person and on the PSC website, and the meeting is being recorded and streamed so that it will be available for later use as well. The schedule today is we have scheduled 20 minutes approximately for the presentations, and the additional time will be reserved for commission questions and then ensuing discussion that we may want to have. We plan on at least 1 hour, but if everybody's willing and the topic warrants, we may spill into the second hour a little bit. With that, are there any questions about the format for today's meeting? Oh, good. President Brown has also joined us. Welcome, President Brown, Commission President James Brown.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
Thank you for being here. Okay, today's informational meeting is part of a continued effort on the part of the commission to gather information surrounding the topics of energy grid resilience and wildfire mitigation. As the landscape of the grid mitigation practices and energy sector practices shift, the commission is focused on maintaining awareness of existing practices and programs aimed at solving the issues of grid resilience and, particular to most Western states, protecting the grid from wildfire incidents. Recently, the commission heard from Northwestern Energy on their 2024 wildfire mitigation plan, and today we'll receive overviews from two other programs. First, we will hear from Zev Hunting of the United States Forest Service regarding the agency's wildfire mitigation efforts in transmission corridors. And Mr. Hunting will be followed by Kyla Mackey from the Montana Department of Environmental Quality Energy Planning Section regarding the Montana Energy Infrastructure Resilience Grant Program. So thank you all for being here. If there's no questions on procedures for today, we will just go ahead with Mr. Hunting, and you have the floor to deliver your presentation.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Sorry. Thank you for having me, Mr. President, Madam Vice President, Commission members. My name is Zev Hunting, and I work for the Forest Service out of the northern region, or what we call Region 1. That includes Idaho, Montana, parts of South Dakota, and North Dakota. First, I wanted to share with you all some of my background and history and experience so you can see the perspective by which, or the lens by which I was looking at trying to formulate a plan when it came to mitigating wildfire threat around power lines. So I began my fire career in 1988 in Susanville, California on an AD fire crew. Worked in fire until about 2012, held several positions within the agency. Transitioned in 2012 into our land special uses arena, which is special use permits, i.e. power line permits, pipelines, those types of things. Hung on my boots really in 2017. It was about the last year I was active in fire and have been doing land special uses ever since. So for about the last 12 years, very active out on the ground with power companies during vegetation management and infrastructure projects. So I've seen both it on the ground as well as the administrative side. Have been on the forefront of trying to develop strategies for how we approach power line resilience in Region 1. The slide's not advancing. Thank you. Okay. So from the chief directly, the following statement was granted to us, given to us as kind of his leader's intent and our guideline to follow. And, you know, in addition to this, the caveat that all lands, all hands has been used in combination with this, but the chief basically told us to use and prioritize all resources and authorities to expedite actions to reduce wildfire threat to communities, critical infrastructure, meaning power lines, public health and safety, and natural resources.
Zev, can you tell us when that statement was made and which chief?
It's our current chief of the Forest Service, and I believe the statement was rendered in 2022 or 2023 in a briefing to the agency.
Thank you.
So we made an assessment of all the power lines in Region 1. We gathered up GIS data to the best of our ability, worked with several power companies on doing that, utilized existing data that we had in our database, and sought public sources of data, GIS data, to basically take an overview, the 30,000 foot level view of what power lines look like in Region 1, the extent and scope of that, and how they interacted with National Forest Systems lands. From there, we talked to our regional leadership team, presented there twice, which yielded from our regional forester, Leanne Martin, her leader's intent to back up the chief's leader's intent that power line objectives will be incorporated into all of our vegetation management strategies as a component of it, not as a side, bar to it. So part of that was that we reached out on June 5th of 2023 to solicit the utility priorities and better understand their perspective on what the issue was around vegetation and power lines and how we could work together to tackle the looming issue. I'm sure folks have seen the news and watched some of the catastrophic wildfires that have occurred over the years. They appear to be intense, increasing in intensity, size, and duration. So the time is right for us to start to tackle this and look at how we do that together. So what we told them is that this is their chapter to write. We want to understand from their perspective what it is, the challenges that they face out there on the landscape. We know that they were the subject matter experts, so having their perspective and their guidance a lot was invaluable to us. We also wanted to understand where they perceived the risk to be greatest and where the needs were greatest from their perspective. And we wanted them to understand that we believe that they can make a difference at the local level on the ground, really where the focus needs to be. Looks like we got an error again here. There we go. So we had some meetings and we've been continuously talking to utility companies. I've been continuously talking to utility companies for quite some time. Now that, like I said, that started back in about 2012. But I was assigned a new position in the Forest Service back in November of 2022 as the regional energy coordinator. And that allowed me to approach this more from a regional perspective rather than just local forest perspective. So we had 2 rounds of meetings with the MECA group, the Montana Electric Cooperative Association, and all in between there, We were talking to organizations such as Northwestern Energy, Bonneville Power, other power companies in other states. And we described to them what, the resilient energy corridor strategy was and what does it mean to them. So the resilient energy corridor strategy is basically the holistic approach to grid hardening and the nexus of how that occurs on federal land. It ties directly into the chief's national cohesive wildfire management strategy, nicknamed the Wildfire Crisis Strategy. And when I looked at the nexus of power lines and national forest systems lands, and even beyond that on the private state lands, other jurisdictions, it became very apparent to us that the goals of the Wildfire Crisis Strategy align directly with the Resilient Energy Corridor Strategy, and that if we use the Resilient Energy Corridor Strategy, it would be considered to be more of an implementation plan under the Wildfire Crisis Strategy. We also explained that we understand that this is going to take all hands on all lands. So industry and agency is imperative. We also understood that, given certain incidents that had occurred after the Camp Fire in Paradise, California, the Dixie Fire in California, the Lahaina Fire in Hawaii and Maui was a surprise. We understood that legislative support, both at the state and federal level, would likely be included. And part of that, driver is funding, but also I'm curious to see how laws will be enacted that influence how we do business together in the future. But with the support of those three entities, I felt that we could probably put a bullseye around the Resilient Energy Corridor Strategy right in the middle of the Wildfire Crisis Strategy. And that we really couldn't do it without all three entities engaged. So after last summer, June, we gave our briefing to the regional leadership team. We were tasked with developing short, medium, and long range treatment strategies and objectives. And we needed a standard in order to understand what the scope of that meant to the agency. So we pulled this out of the integrated vegetation management model. That's the wire border zone concept. And really what it describes is transmission lines, how we can most effectively manage risk around transmission lines. But it became apparent to me that there isn't much difference between a transmission line and a distribution line when it comes to the risk of a tree strike or a fire occurring as a result of vegetation. So I applied this model across the board. It is the industry standard, and it symbolizes the desired condition that we hope to achieve. An overhead view of this, because there's more outside of the wire and border zone, shows the beyond the border zone, right? Internally, the two small square boxes in there represent substations. So the red dashed line is the line in between substations. Sorry, it's not to scale. But typically that's where the bulk of the utility work occurs. That's the area delineated by the special use authorization. And primarily that is what we consider to be the utility zone, or where the utility does the bulk of their work under the scope of their authorization. The border zone, or the hazard tree zone, the strike zone, I've heard it called a few different things, is where the Forest Service, the agency, or the landowner comes together with the utility to get that work done and manage that risk in that zone. And then outside of that border zone is typically thought of as the area where the Forest Service would come in and do fuels mitigation outside of the potential strike zone. So the plan, we wanted to be much more proactive than reactive to this. We've been reactive for a long time. So in response to our regional forester's request to develop a plan, and in reviewing the data and looking where the nexus of where we have potential for cooperation and to get some good work done, the first thing that we looked at is incorporating power line objectives into our large scale or broad scale NEPA projects, right? These are our proposed actions. Typically require an environmental analysis or environmental impact statement. Again, it's the large scale proposed action. And we wanted to ensure that power line objectives weren't just a part of the project, but they became standard operating procedure that we incorporate them in. In some areas, the gaps, so to speak, we started talking about standalone projects such as fuel break CE under our new categorical exclusion authority, which allows us to treat up to 3,000 acres, 1,000 feet wide on linear events. A very handy tool. And this is also where we started to see great opportunity for us to start coordinating some of our efforts with some of our cooperators and partners, such as the DNRC under the Good Neighbor Authority, right? This seemed to fit their objectives. The proposal sounded good to them. And I know that they had their eye on this, and it seemed to make sense to them. So when we proposed what we had seen as far as utility priorities, they gravitated to it. We also set up a model where we could examine past treatments where existing NEPA was and where treatments had occurred in the past, so we could connect the dots if there was additional treatments that may need to occur out there. And we've been driving home the point that, power lines aren't just about vegetation management. Grid hardening isn't just about vegetation management. It's about the holistic approach. So expediting infrastructure projects was a big part of this plan. So rebuilding power lines and allowing more rapid processing of project proposals to do that. So as aggressive and I have to say I'm proud of the plan. We've seen greater movement around vegetation management and infrastructure projects in Region 1 than ever before in the last 12 years that I've been doing this. So we're really making good strides in the direction that we need to go. However, NEPA decisions take time. The large scale process take time. It takes time to coordinate with our cooperators, such as the DNRC, on projects, even if they are small, NEPA, like a categorical exclusion. So we turn to Section 512 to understand better what authorities were granted under that change in the law and what we could do with it. And I'll pause right now and ask, as everybody understand what Section 512 is of the Federal Land Policy Management Act?
Okay, that's what I was going to ask, was the reference to what 512 is in. So
Okay,
I think
so
you just explained it.
In 2018, under the Appropriations Act, Section 512 amended the Federal Land Policy Management Act to incorporate a section on operating plans and guided us through what the requirements are on there. However, it wasn't the only thing that Section 512 did. It kind of redefined how we work with the utilities and what authorities are afforded to them under that section in the law. So I'll go through a couple of those that are highlighted and topics of discussion that we discussed with several of our utility partners. So one of the biggest changes really in not just in hazard tree, but in how we manage power lines was the hazard tree definition that is now currently under our regulations under 36 CFR 251.50. This hazard tree definitions is specific to power lines, and it expands on the conventional understanding of hazard tree, where it's no longer just the dead, dying, sprung root wads, codominant top type of scenario. It also talks about the geographic and atmospheric orientation of the vegetation to the power lines. In addition to the hazard tree definition, under our special use authorization, Section 512 amended this clause in, which I'll allow folks a couple minutes to read so you can fully digest it. Just let me know when folks are done reading it.
Well, it looks like the two commissioners here are finished.
Okay, thank you. So this clause is new with respect to vegetation management, and clarifies some of the language that we started to see being developed under the 2005 Energy Policy Act, and really directs. This is more for the utility company themselves to have an understanding of what they can do if they perceive that there are hazard trees or an imminent threat outside of their corridor to the infrastructure that they're trying to maintain. The one part of this that we've had a conversation with several utilities on, again at the MECA meeting just a week or so ago, and throughout to the other utilities, is that having a coordinated effort behind this might actually be the best opportunity we've had in combination with this clause that's in the special use authorization. What I mean by that is that we would be better served if we came together and identified things like purchasers for the timber. There are vegetation stipulations around slash disposal and disposal of merchantable timber. So having this being a more coordinated effort rather than coming at us, as the project is done and then, explaining it 30 days later. I felt that it would be helpful if we explained it up front to our authorized officers, i.e. the forest supervisors and district rangers on the individual forests, so that we come up with a game plan that really worked and have a better end product as a result.
Just a quick, I guess, a clarifying question on this paragraph here. The holder, is that a utility company?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Under the holders are the people who hold the special use authorization. Also understood that partnerships are going to be critical for our success here. Obviously the partnership between industry and agency is paramount. For nothing else but the respect of treating along the power line right of way and any regulatory requirements for being able to fall trees next to the power line. This is something that has been that we are taught in the agency. Power lines are hazardous. Power lines are dangerous. We don't typically fall trees right next to power lines where they could fall into the power line. So it's going to be imperative that we work together with industry on that. But also our external partnerships, or what we call our keystone partners, are going to be imperative to help funding this mechanism now and into the future. And there are several keystone partners engaged with us on other vegetation management efforts around the region and around the country. A couple of them are listed here. We described the relationship with the National Forest Foundation to the MECA group, who we felt was important that we get out in front of this, but partnerships apply across the board to any utility provider or owner operator. But there's a lot of opportunity here to explore partnerships, and I believe that they are going to be imperative moving forward, not just to get work done, but to help fund the mechanism that's going to be required to do that. And that is the end of my presentation.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Hunting. Are there any questions from commissioners on this portion of the presentation?
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you. Yeah, this was it's a very, very interesting presentation. And up until this morning, I was really unaware of any positive actions by the federal government and forestry and whatever to deal with this wildfire threat. I just spent 2 hours this morning on a conference call put on by our Maxwell Association, NAREC. It's a regulators roundtable series on wildfires and affordability, financial, regulatory, and policy issues for regulators. It's a 4-session roundtable, and the first segment was today. And one of the national people on the call indicated that the efforts to work with Department of Interior and many different federal agencies are very, very slow and cumbersome for getting permits by utilities for maintenance of their lines and for vegetation management. So it sounds like from what you presented that that's a real priority, but government, the wheels of government turning without oil and grease indicates to me that it's not working that well. My question on the roundtable, I'll ask you to comment on that, but my question on the roundtable had to do with the credit reporting agencies, Moody's and S&P, to what degree are they taking any progress on the federal government level on the forestry, any progress that they've made on forest management that beneficially impacts the reduction of fire risk that would be rated to the how these credit rating agencies would how that reflects on the individual utility. And all this has to do with the cost of insurance. The amount of risk equals the cost of insurance. And that is the principal issue as to whether or not there's any progress being made fast enough. Utilities are able to afford insurance on this issue. I know that's a bunch of things that I just came off of this webinar. And the last thing I'd say is that you mentioned about partnerships, and you've been working on this for quite some time and very productively, I can see. But the Montana Public Service Commission has, up to this point, as far as I am aware, not been a partner to this. It is our obligation to provide for reliable, affordable, abundant energy, and therefore the wildfire mitigation, how it affects performance of the utilities, is definitely in our wheelhouse. And I'm glad that you came here today, and we would be very interested in participating in these partnerships in the future. That's a bunch, but that's the top of my head.
Mr. Hunting, would you care to respond?
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for the questions. I'll try and break it down as best I can if I can remember all that. So
Thank you.
When our regional forester asked for a strategy, it became apparent to me that we needed to take a multifaceted approach to address this portion of the wildfire crisis strategy. So when we looked at proposed actions, when we looked at smaller scale projects in partnership with potentially DNRC or other partners, when we looked at infrastructure projects, and when we looked at potentially connecting the dots from past projects, there was one category that kept jumping out to me, and that was kind of the immediate need, right? And so as I was going over the hazard tree definition under our regulations and citing the clause that's in the new permit forms, I believe that might be the missing link, so to speak, or category 5 in that, where the power company does have more authority by those clause and that definition to at least have a conversation with us and take a look at how do we address this more immediately. So that's the immediate need side of it. My sole motivation for this is, based on my past fire experience, fires that I've been on that were power line ignited or fires where communities were burned and people lost their houses. I'm on a mission to correct how we do business in the agency around power lines. So my sole motivation is to protect our communities, hopefully save lives and protect the natural resource. But in doing so, as we reduce risk, there should be obvious and clear benefits to power companies around things like insurance, I would hope. Part of the risk reduction model does take into account the long-term management strategy of what we're talking about. And under the integrated veg management model and the wire border zone concept that I showed you, most experts out there, Randy Miller was one that I was talking to, who is the author of those models, and some of the ANSI, the standard that we now see out there from the Utility Arborist Association. They all feel that applying that model is not only a risk reducing model, but also a cost savings model as well. So the better we do around managing the border zone and outside of the utility corridor, the cheaper theoretically it is for the utilities themselves, therefore bringing down costs, hopefully, to the customers and changing the equation on things like insurance. Does that answer your question, Mr. Commissioner?
Well, thank you. How, from what I've heard, it's very sporadic. Individual forest region managers or individual forests, I guess, have different approaches to forest management. Has there been any nationwide approach to forest management that takes into account this wildfire threat and mitigation of that?
Yeah, the wildfire crisis strategy is that strategy around vegetation management, but there's a lot of competition within that. And there are differing trains of thought on what it is to protect the community, right? When I was hired back in November of 22, I realized that the voice around power line vegetation management and the resilient energy corridor strategy was not that strong. We're gathering momentum. We're seeing more and more forests that are incorporating power line objectives as standard operating procedure into their proposed actions. Again, we're talking to our partners like the DNRC to, determine how can we be more responsive to the power companies out on the ground? How do we facilitate getting NEPA done quicker? Those kinds of things are on the forefront of the conversations. But also in line with that is also having conversations with our community collaboratives, folks that people trust in the community, like our rural fire chiefs, getting out in front of our Firewise groups and making sure that they're aware of this. If we need to do public service announcements, things like that. We're still in the infancy of the resilient energy corridor strategy as a nationwide strategy or even as a regional wide strategy, but we are gathering a lot of momentum and we're learning. So we're doing a better job and we continue to grow on it.
Thank you.
Let me tell you that, pardon me.
Go ahead, Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you. I wanted to say that I appreciate your language. You said that if I would quote you, said, "I am on a mission," and I appreciate that very, very much. This is not just simply a job, but this is something that you believe in, and I think that is a precursor to a lot of great successful projects. Please keep us the PSC involved in this on a partnership basis. So we have certain authorities, and I myself and some other commissioners have been deeply involved, and other commissioners with the wildfire things, not knowing what all other sectors are doing. We would like to be regarded as a partner in this. A part of it, we have certain authorities that we can bring to bear, and we really appreciate your dedication to this issue and your presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell, and you got it. I want everybody to be informed and engaged.
Okay, thank you. President Brown, do you have any questions?
I do not at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Commissioner Bukacek? Questions from Commissioner Bukacek. Okay, I've got a few. Thank you very much. Great presentation. I'm very pleased to see this approach. It's appears to be a bottom-up approach, which is something you don't see very often, or I haven't seen very often from the Forest Service. It directly contrasts what we're seeing right now as the proposed old growth forest planning rule that's coming from the White House, where this top-down approach, one size fits all type strategy is under consideration by the U.S. Forest Service right now. And I'm wondering, does your program and the approach and the directive you've been given by the chief for the local planning, and it seems like you have a lot of latitude to use your discretion and to get things done quickly. How does this interface with the old growth forest amendment that's being proposed to the forest plans? And do you see a collision or conflict between those two things?
I'm going to thank you, Madam Vice President, for the question. I believe the proposed action, the National Register for the amendment to old growth came out today or last week at some point. But I'm going to let Joe answer the question to his best of his ability, because I think he can better answer that question for you.
Mr. Coleman?
Or members of the commission, Madam Vice President. Joe Coleman, I'm the state liaison for the Forest Service to the state of Montana. Thank you for the commission for the question, Madam Vice President. I think the National Old Growth Policy amendment is just that. It's an amendment. It's out for public comment right now. I know that the Region 1 leadership has thought the amendment wouldn't really change much how Region 1 does business, because a lot of the forest plans in Montana have been updated. So I think that's the short answer. I think we will wait to be seen. The public comment does allow for different entities to comment. I know DNRC is a cooperating agency. I think some of the counties are cooperating agencies on that too. That proposal did come from the White House, clearly being implemented by the Department of Agriculture, but we are taking public comment on that, and then how it's implemented will be at the local level with each forest.
Thank you for your response to that. Were you present at the EQC meeting last week when this was discussed with that committee, the legislative committee?
Madam Vice President, I was.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that works out, because it seems like it's in direct opposition to the approach that was explained today by Mr. Hunting, which seems like a very good and responsive, workable approach. So, okay, moving on to my other questions. It sounds like a good program. It sounds like a good approach. I guess I'm wondering, are there any quantifiable objectives or reports on progress, or is it too early in the process to get to that point yet?
Yeah, one of the challenges we face is that, each forest tends to operate autonomously, and I'm not at the, we're not always communicated with in my shop with that. So we are trying to change the equation on how we communicate around this topic, resilient energy corridor strategy. I do believe there are quantifiable measures at this point with respect to how we're moving through the planning process or the NEPA process. I don't have any quantifiable results as far as actually implemented projects, but they are occurring. Coordination calls between entities are increasing, and as I join those, it's just a third party or a fly on the wall to listen in. I hear the good work that's going on out there, where the forest is directly talking to the utilities, and they're coming up with game plans for things like hazard tree removal, or even a greater strategy around fuel reduction outside of that wire border zone area. So there are results. It is pretty early in the process, but stay tuned, because I think we're going to know and understand a lot more where we've seen success in the near future. Okay. But thank you for your question, Madam Vice President.
Mr. Coleman.
members of the commission, Madam Vice President. I know you remember this, but you and I talked back in 2013, the last time the Forest Service presented to the Public Service Commission, and you were in a different role then, as was I. But this was, the wildfire crisis around utility corridors was something that was, on people's minds more than 10 years ago. And so what Mr. Hunting and I think the region have got going since then, and some of it, as Mr. Hunting said, are due to some unfortunate fires, is there's a lot more awareness around it now. Mr. Hunting presented to the Energy Committee, Northwestern Energy presented to you on some of their concerns about liability. Zev worked really hard to get the co-ops to come in and talk with him and build relationships with them, because while the Forest Service certainly manages a lot of land in Montana, this goes across boundaries too. These are private landowners, other agencies, other public agencies that own land. So there's a lot of coordination in there that has gone in to that. And the addition of DNRC with some of the extra funding they have through the Good Neighbor Authority to take on some of these projects has been pretty new too. So since 2013, a lot of conversations have happened, and there's just a lot more momentum, I would say would be the most marketable thing now.
I hope so. So thanks for bringing that up. Because in 2013, there was a room full of Forest Service employees here in this room presenting to the commission, and I was present as an observer when I was a member of the Senate. And there was quantifiable information presented at that time, if I remember correctly. Now, it's been a little while since I looked at that report, but I believe it was 10,000 miles of transmission lines were at risk in Western states. And it was almost 1,000 miles, just shy of 1,000 miles of transmission lines in Montana that were categorized as at risk from wildfire. And the risk was primarily associated with vegetation management or lack thereof. And so it seemed like the Forest Service at that time was giving us a warning that, hey, we're trying to get states on board with knowing that there's a real problem out there and working with us to try to resolve that problem. So they had quantified how many miles were at risk. And I'd like to know, are we better off now, or are we worse off now than we were back in 2013 when that report was given? As far as the actual progress on the ground.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, members of the commission. I do believe there's been substantial progress that's been made. It's difficult to quantify that because a lot of the projects that the Forest Service has engaged in do surround power lines. Power lines are in the wildland urban interface. Most of them tend to occur, where there's power lines, where there's houses, there's power lines. So it's not hard to find those. And with our objective under the wildfire crisis strategy, there's been a lot of direct fuels management around those communities in the wildland urban interface. So there has been some benefit to the power line. What we haven't done a whole lot of, but it has happened, and again, I can't quantify the number of the relationship, is actually had dedicated power line projects as an objective under proposed action large scale or as a smaller project. So that's where we're coming into the light with respect to gaining momentum and traction on these and making some hay hopefully here in the near future, because while there has been a focus and an emphasis on power lines, we're just now starting to come into the light on how exactly it is that we're going to do this and work in partnership with our utilities.
Okay, thank you. I know that I gather from Northwestern's wildfire mitigation plan that they've identified priority areas. So it'd be helpful to see what the Forest Service has identified as priority areas too, and see where those correlate and where they don't correlate. And I'd be particularly interested in seeing if there's any conflict with that old growth amendment that is, proposed to amend all of the forest plans, and see, is that going to affect the ability to be proactive in managing vegetation in these areas? Maybe it won't be a problem, but I know the legislative committee was really concerned about that. Mr. Coleman?
So we have identified priority areas, right? Priority landscapes, priority fire sheds. The wildland urban interface is a priority area. So those areas have been delineated by the Forest Service. There are also power line priorities that do not exist within priority landscapes or priority fire sheds. So bridging the gap on that and educating folks that it's like not all of our priorities around power lines occur necessarily within our priority areas that are designated. That's a reality of what we're faced with. So that's why it's so imperative that we're talking to the utilities and asking them, what is the priority here? Where are you experiencing the problems? Where, you go out on the power line right away and you look up and you see the splices, in the power line. It's pretty easy to discern that might be a higher priority area than, an area with similar vegetation, but maybe not the same atmospheric conditions, right? So understanding where the power companies determine that their priorities are is imperative for us to assess the risk out there as a whole and integrate it into our eventual vegetation management plans.
Okay, thank you. So I appreciate the diagram that you presented with the power line corridor and the what'd you call it? Next to the corridor, there was
The border zone.
the border zone. We have a 500 kV transmission line. My husband and I do going through our property. So we're kind of familiar with the size of the right of way and the clearing under it. And we try to take care of our forest land around it. But where those transmission lines go through Forest Service lands, obviously the forest surrounding those corridors is imperative to manage too. And on a landscape scale, how are your goals meshing with the management on a larger scale of like a watershed where, if that burns really hot and you get all this runoff, it's going to, possibly erode your the transmission towers and things that cause damage after the fire. Is your program able to reach that far to impact those types of decisions and prioritizing larger landscape scale forest management or treatment of the vegetation?
Thank you, Madam Vice President, members of the commission. Yes, I do believe it is. Municipal watersheds, dams, facilities like that are also considered to be critical infrastructure. So when we have those two present, they tend to elevate in priority from our perspective, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that elevates it from the perspective of the utility provider as far as their priority, because they tend to be kind of singularly focused on their infrastructure itself. But it's fairly easy for us to pull back, look at a map, and see where those municipal watersheds, we know how important they are to our communities and that we preserve and protect them. So it only elevates the priority when we have two or more factors present.
Good. That's great. I have one more question. We're not going to cut into your time, Ms. Mackey, but on that subject, I'm really curious, how does it work inside the agency when there's an active wildfire and there's decisions being made by administrators regarding the administrative intent of how that particular area should be managed. For example, I'm familiar with a fire in my area a couple summers ago, and it was the incident commander and the forest district ranger that I met with afterwards. And I said, why were the fire lines drawn so far away from the actual fire? Why did you light back fires miles and miles away from the actual fire? Why did that much area have to be burned? And there was a lot of concern in the community about that. Those questions were being asked by county commissioners and citizens. And a lot of people were frustrated by how much landscape was burned up intentionally by the Forest Service. And it came down to one thing. They both said it was the administrative intent to treat that area. And I've seen some other information that, that the fires, when they're small, present an opportunity for forest managers to create larger backfires to treat an area that they've wanted to treat for a while, but couldn't because of the red tape and things. So I guess what I'm going to is, are you involved in those decisions regarding administrative intent when there is active fire on how much area should be ignited, and, looking at and assessing whether there's any of those critical infrastructure elements within that area that would influence that kind of decision?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. I am not involved in those decisions. And I'm not sure, Joe, do you have anything to add to that? I do know that when there is a smoke report and in certain areas, such as wilderness areas and places like that, that we do tend to analyze what that looks like. I believe the process is called WFDS.
What's it called?
WFDS. I don't understand. I am not 100% sure what the acronym means, but there is a process for evaluation.
Madam Vice President, members of the commission, I can get you some more information on that specific. I know you've brought that up before, and we can get some more specific information on that. I mean, the policy is fires are suppression action. The idea is to put the fire out. There are a lot of indirect and direct tactics that go into that, and a lot of considerations of critical infrastructure, public safety, watersheds, those kinds of things. And then also it's firefighter safety, public safety, all of those things. So each fire is managed in that way, but I can, get you whatever summary reports or whatever were available on the fire you're talking about.
Thank you. And not just that fire, just the whole concept of administrative intent and how that decision is made and who's involved in those decisions. That'd be really helpful if you could shed some light on that for us.
Yes, Madam Vice President.
Thank you very much. Okay, seeing no other questions from the commission, we are going to move on to Ms. Mackey's presentation. And thank you, gentlemen. If you could hang out for a while, we'd appreciate it because we may circle back. But Ms. Mackey, you now have the floor. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Vice President Fielder, President Brown, and members of the commission. My name is Kyla Mackey. I am the Energy Planning Section Supervisor at the Energy Office at the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Today I'll be talking about a new grant program we have called the Montana Energy Infrastructure Resilience Grant Program. And I can wait till my presentation comes up here.
For those listening, just stand by. We're bringing the presentation up and it will be up momentarily.
Great. There we go. So first, just by way of background, just to talk a little bit about DEQ Energy Office's role in this topic of wildfire mitigation. We are the primary agency for the state's energy support function 12, ESF 12, which is supporting the state during energy emergencies. That means that we coordinate with utilities, fuel suppliers, and others during emergencies related to energy supply, impacts on energy infrastructure. That also includes monitoring and communicating wildfire impacts on energy supply pricing and infrastructures to disaster and emergency services, as well as the governor's office. We are also responsible for Montana's state energy security plan. This was formerly the state's energy assurance plan, has a new name. It's the state's energy security plan. And with some of the federal funding that we receive, we are required to develop this energy security plan. The purpose of that plan is to assess and propose methods to strengthen the state's energy security abilities. That's during times of disruptive events, and as well as assessing just what supply and what the different sectors' response, mitigation, other actions that are available in the state. In addition, as part of our role, we also have been designated as the lead agency to administer some new funding from the U.S. Department of Energy through their grid resilience formula grants. This is from the U.S. Department of Energy, and it's their preventing outages and enhancing the resilience of the electric grid grants to states and tribes. The purpose of this funding is to address current and future all hazards grid resilience needs across the states and tribal nations, as well as reducing customer outages. That's a primary focus of this funding, is helping reduce customer outages across the U.S. The total amount of funding available for the states and tribes is $2.3 billion. And that's again via formula funding to each of the states and tribes. Montana's portion of this funding, the state was allocated $35 million over 5 years. So it's coming out to about 7.3 million available each year between the years 2022 and 2027. We do have currently have available the first 2 years of funding, which is $13.7 million. And we have an open request for applications. And within that funding, as required by the federal law, is that we're required to set aside funding for small utilities. So in Montana, of course, this would be the rural electric co-ops. And we've set aside the percentage that of the service territory in the state that is with the small utilities. So that's about 41% in Montana of customers are served by a small utility. So that comes out to about $5.6 million is available specifically for small utilities under this program. The minimum award that we've established is $50,000 with a maximum award for projects at $3 million. Our structure for this funding is going to be granting this out to subrecipients. So any eligible applicant under the federal guidelines is going to be a subrecipient. We're essentially the pass-through agency for this funding. Applications are due July 3rd. So next Wednesday. We did just extend this deadline today based on the questions we've received and the interest in this funding opportunity. So in order to receive the funds, we did have to submit an application, which included our own specific state program objectives. We had also had some public input into what our application for this funding looked like and what these objectives were. These objectives, we have 4. Number 1 is improving reliability and resilience of Montana's electric transmission and distribution system during disruptive events, with a focus specifically on wildfire, but any disruptive events go. So that could be flooding, winter storms, winter weather, high wind events. Additionally, another objective was reducing the likelihood and consequences and duration of consequences that of customer outages affecting community facilities and critical infrastructure, and then limiting the potential for wildfire ignition from transmission distribution equipment, and also reducing the scope and the consequence and impacts of those public safety power shutoffs that utilities may engage during wildfire. So wildfire, again, was a very specific focus of our objectives, knowing that's one of the highest risks in the state. And then also increasing the skilled workforce within Montana through these projects, employing Montanans for projects that submit applications. That's one of the things that we'll be prioritizing through our application review process. So the eligible applicants for this program, and this is from the federal guidelines, it is limited to electric grid operators, electricity generators, electricity storage operators, transmission owners or operators, as well as distribution providers and fuel suppliers, and then any other relevant entities as determined by the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Energy. And so there's a process for entities outside of that list that may want to apply for funding to submit their eligible entity application. There's a number of projects that are eligible through this program. It's a wide range of projects. So it includes weatherization technologies and equipment, fire-resistant technologies and fire prevention systems, any monitoring and control technologies placed in the transmission or distribution system, undergrounding of any electrical equipment, managing utility poles that may be in the right of way at risk of during wildfire events, any relocation of power lines or reconductoring of any power lines with low seg advanced conductors, which also helps limit the risk of wildfire ignition. And then of course, vegetation and fuel load management is also eligible. Continuing that list, any use or construction of distributed energy resources for enhancing the system capacity during disruptive events. So that could include microgrids and battery storage subcomponents, adaptive protection technologies, advanced modeling technologies, hardening of power lines against weather-related incidents, events, as well as any other hardening of facilities and other systems, and then replacement of old overhead conductors and underground cables. So quite the range of types of projects that are eligible under this funding. The only thing, there's a couple of things specifically not on that list. So any generation, so say a solar facility, a wind facility, the funding could not be used for the generation project itself. But battery storage is eligible because that can help enhance capacity or adaptive capacity and reduce customer outages in some areas. Also, any projects that's specifically related to cybersecurity is not eligible specifically for funding under this. So for our program and application review, we developed some scoring criteria with associated metrics that we will be evaluating applications. The first category criteria that we developed was the project's resilience and reliability benefits. So there's a number of metrics under each of these categories, but under this category, that includes any projected downward trend in frequency and duration of outages, improvement in recovery time from any outages, and then the number of miles of transmission or distribution corridors that are treated to reduce wildfire-caused system outages. And then we also are evaluating the customer and community benefits of a project. So that would just be the total number of customers specifically in a, say, utility service territory that are benefiting from the project. We're also considering the number of hospitals, emergency shelters, key retail, water treatment, and other facilities that may be served by any resilience project. And then one of the kind of unique metrics that we are also looking at is the number of customers in a project or service area that will be less vulnerable to service interruptions due to public safety power shutoff events. We're also considering evaluating workforce and economic development benefits from each of these projects. Innovation is another category we're looking at. So specifically, any project that proposes to deploy advanced technologies, and then any technology investments to reduce wildfire ignition potential from utility assets will be scored higher under the innovation category. And then, of course, just the overall budget and the cost for the project, we'll be evaluating that. And then on the project immediacy, that criteria, we're really looking at how long of a NEPA review a project might require. So anything that might be outside or on the transmission or distribution system within the existing right-of-way will likely score higher than a new project that's in a new area or breaking new ground and require more NEPA review. So here's our timeline for this 13.7 million first 2 years of funding. As I mentioned, the first round of applications are due next Wednesday, July 3rd. And then we are having an agency review committee review those applications. Our intent is to do that the week of July 8th. And then we will have our intent to award to successful applicants out by July 26th. And then this timeline is somewhat uncertain, but there is a federal review and compliance determination for the projects. And we're not certain exactly how long those reviews take. As I mentioned, sometimes the environmental review can take a little bit longer, but we're anticipating by October of this year that we'll have the final contracts with the successful applicants, and those would be signed, and hopefully project work can begin before the winter season. That's our goal with the timeline. Here's just a couple of helpful links. We have our website where you can review the request for applications. All of the additional attachments and required application form, those are on the state's contracting EMAX website. But you can review the request for applications on our website. And then the U.S. Department of Energy has a Grid Resilience Grant Program website with more information about the federal requirements and some examples of projects that some other states have completed with some of the project proposers and applicants. But those are both helpful resources. And there's my contact information, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation and for the information. Do we have questions from commissioners? Commissioner O'Donnell, do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. President Brown? Hearing none from President Brown. Okay, a few from me. We don't want you to feel left out by not having any questions. So, just to clarify, this is the first round of funding is going to be the application deadline is next week for your very first round. So you haven't made any awards yet, correct?
We have not.
Okay. Do you have any applications in from the regulated utilities, Northwestern Energy or Montana Dakota's utility?
So far, I haven't seen who's applied. We've had a couple applications 100% completed and submitted. I know there was interest. So we had an informational session back in May about our grant program and the process, and all of the, or both MDU and Northwestern attended that meeting. And then there's quite a bit of interest from the electric co-ops as well.
Okay. So I did a little quick math here while you were giving your presentation. So you have 7.3 million roughly on average for the 5-year program. 5.6 million of that is reserved for small utilities. And so that leaves 1.7 million for the larger utilities and whoever else might be eligible. So Do you know why the large utilities that have so much more infrastructure and area, service area, have such a small cut of the eligibility?
Yeah. So sorry, Vice President Fielder, the 5.6 million was out of the 13.7 million. So it's 41% of each funding cycle. However much total we have available is set aside for the small utilities. And I think part of the purpose was there is a focus of this funding on rural areas, which are typically served by smaller rural co-ops that may be more exposed and more at risk, and maybe have more miles of distribution lines serving customers. So, and then again, less resources usually available. If we receive less request for funding in the applications from small utilities, then we roll that into the consideration for everybody else.
Okay, thank you.
So
So just to make sure that I'm correct, then the 5.6 million for the small utilities is out of a total of 13 point what?
13.7.
Okay, so that was a 2-year
Mhm.
total.
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And it was about 41%
Yes.
for small?
Yeah, for small, it's the percentage of customers served by a small utility in the state.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification. That actually makes more sense. And is this just for electric infrastructure, not for natural gas?
It's primarily for electric infrastructure. Each of the eligible projects are, as you could see, geared towards electricity, but again, fuel suppliers are eligible applicants. And so if there was some interdependencies with, fuel supply and electricity, they're thinking like a natural gas system or natural gas facility, there might be an eligible project within that.
Okay, so perhaps weatherization of a natural gas transmission center or something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, good. And then reconductoring looked like it was eligible. And if Commissioner Pinocci were here today, I know he'd ask you about that. So I mean, he's very interested, and I think he's made the commission aware and the legislature aware of new technologies and transmission lines that are higher efficiency, but they're also more resilient to heat and sagging. So they don't sag as much down where fires may be burning, wildfires may be burning on the ground, and they withstand higher heat loads. So have you seen any applications for any of that yet come in?
Vice President Fielder, there is a lot of interest in reconductoring. I think it checks a lot of the boxes that you mentioned of efficiency, reducing wildfire risk in a cost-effective way. And I think that's important too. I know, so the closest thing I've seen is that I believe in Idaho, they completed their first round a couple months ago and shared their applications with me, or what types of projects they received. And I believe they've received a couple for reconductoring.
Okay, terrific. Well, I think the commission will probably be curious to see how our regulated utilities fall in your evaluation process, and whether they take advantage of this program or not, and what projects they put forward. So we'll look forward to updates. I suppose you'll be sending something out when you make awards, so we can take a look at the list of grant awards made.
Yeah, Vice President Fielder, happy to do that, and happy to include the commission, yourself, others on our distribution list for announcements about the funding and which projects it's going to.
That's great. Yeah, I think Trevor Graff is our external affairs coordinator, so he's a great point of contact for both agencies to get information to, so we can distribute it accordingly. All right. Well, thank you very, very much. Any other comments or questions from anybody before we wrap up? Okay, seeing none, we do appreciate the time that you gave us today and the preparation that went into it. Thank you very much for your good work. Keep it up, and We will adjourn this meeting now. It's 3:15 PM. We are adjourned. Thank you.